Mitochondria are a lot more than just producers of ATP. I think of them sort of like sailors on a ship. I mean, it really feels like they're the real people, and we're just like a spaceship that they're piloting, because they're moving around inside of our cells, turning things on, turning things off, using the different organelles, using the DNA. The DNA isn't the brain. The DNA is the blueprints, and the mitochondria are the architects.
Dr. Chaffee, really excited to be visiting with you again. I owe you just a huge debt and so much appreciation. The first time you came on the Sowing Prosperity podcast, it was the first video that just kind of took off, and so you have helped me tremendously. Maybe even if you didn't know that, so definitely thank you and appreciate you coming back on.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that, and you're very welcome. Thank you for having me back.
So one of the things that I wanted to discuss is as we continue learning about cancer, health, all of the things that come into that, right? Because it goes down the regenerative agriculture path, the diet, the nutrition, lifestyle, that's becoming more and more evident. But recently you and a lot of others, including Dr. Seyfried, have put out a new paper on glioblastoma and a metabolic approach. And so I wanted to kind of get your take on why did you participate in this, and maybe how did you participate, and what can we glean from that cancer epidemic that we really have going on right now?
Well, this paper was really trying to formalize protocol for ketogenic metabolic therapy in the treatment of cancer. There are a lot of studies. I mean, we're talking hundreds of studies in both humans and animals showing the benefits of ketogenic diet for the treatment of cancer, various cancer, many different types of cancers as well. So Professor Seyfried has been doing a lot of research specifically on glioblastoma, which is the most common primary brain tumor, meaning the cancer that originates in the central nervous system. And it is also the most aggressive and most deadly cancer as well. So it's a good topic of research, because we haven't had much improvement in our treatment practices in a century. A century ago, we started being able to do brain surgery with Dr. Cushing, and if you could get a full resection of GBM, then glioblastoma, your average survival time was about 12 months. It was 3 months without treatment. Now it's 15 to 18 months. So with chemo and radiation, it's really only added a few months, really. So it's not great. And that's with a century of work and research, and a lot of very smart people putting their heads together and trying to figure out what they can do. It really hasn't gotten anywhere. So attacking its metabolic system is what Professor Seyfried had in mind with his research, and it's been very fruitful. It goes on the back of Professor Otto Warburg's research in the 20th century, and that was groundbreaking research. And he sort of figured out that cancer is a metabolic mitochondrial disease. This is before Watson and Crick discovered DNA, and he showed that all cancer cells have damaged mitochondria that can't go through oxidative phosphorylation. And so if you attack that energy, their energy supply, it's not any war. You attack the supply lines, you cut the army off, they shrivel up, die, and go away, right? Same thing with cancer. You attack their supply lines, you attack their means of producing energy, and the cancers go away. They die. They physically die because they need energy for their cellular action. Cancer cells have a high metabolic rate, but they also have very inefficient energy production. So it's called the Warburg effect. And they require about 400 times the amount of glucose as normal cells. So if you just attack the glucose, then they can be significantly curtailed in their growth. We make glucose, but we only have about 4 grams of glucose running through our bloodstream at any given time. If our blood sugar is 85, 90, you have 4 grams of glucose running through your body, and yet we're eating 300-400 grams of carbohydrates a day. Now you're continually sort of making a bit, but you will never make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of grams of glucose under normal conditions. So that's a basic tenet of ketogenic metabolic therapy. Just real quickly, Warburg was a super brilliant guy. I mean, this guy was a Nobel Prize winner, I believe in 1920, and he ended up doing another few decades of research on cancer. And he was so brilliant that people basically just left him alone. He was an openly homosexual Jewish man living with a gay partner in Nazi Germany, and they left him alone.
Yeah.
They just said, you just keep doing your work.
Yeah.
And so Hitler literally knew about him. Everyone knew about him, knew about his proclivities, knew his religious heritage, didn't touch him. Just let him be throughout all of that, those monstrous sort of actions. Just let him be. Just didn't go after him, didn't persecute him, didn't kill him, because a lot of people did get killed for being in that exact same situation. So this guy is a very, very brilliant and prolific researcher. Siegfried has added on to this, showing that cancer cells actually require glutamine as well, and can derive energy from this. And specifically in GBM, glutamine can make up about 75% of the energy production substrate for GBM cells, right? We use the Warburg effect in medicine all the time. We have PET scans, which is a sort of a scan that you can look for metastases. You can see different bright spots, and it's a nuclear test. So you give somebody radioactive or radio-labeled glucose and as an injection, and you see where that glucose goes, because we know that cancer cells love glucose, and so they're going to disproportionately pull that glucose out. So it's not evenly distributed. So when you eat a cracker or a cookie or a cake or ice cream or pizza or pasta, rice, whatever, you need to think about these PET scans, because those cancer cells are going to disproportionately take that glucose out and take it in. That's when you see these big bright spots, and those are those little cancers around the body. And so ketogenic metabolic therapy attacks that. But there have been hundreds of different studies on ketogenic metabolic therapy in both animals and humans, and most of them are slightly different. So they use slightly different amount of carbohydrates. They say, well, low carbohydrate diet, so below 200 grams of carbs a day. To me, that's not low carb. That's massively high carbs. Or others being more ketogenic, they make sure that they're in ketosis. Maybe they'd have below 50 grams or maybe below 20 grams of total carbohydrates a day. And others would actually track ketones. They would look at maybe your glucose to ketone index, a GKI, and actually being more strict and trying to get that into a therapeutic level, like Professor Siegfried does. All of those studies that have a more strict model that use lower and lower amounts of carbohydrates and get their GKI lower and lower, so glucose down, ketones up, they all seem to do better in cancer treatment. And then, of course, there's this idea of glutamine blockade. So we make glutamine just like we make glucose, but you will also get glutamine from your food as well. So you can't really avoid it. It's in meat, it's in vegetables, it's in pretty much any protein source. And so you could fast, and that will hit glucose and glutamine at the same time. It'll get your glucose down lower, get your ketones up higher, get your GKI lower and more therapeutic. But also glutamine can be denatured when you cook it. So if you cook meat more medium well done, that will denature a lot of that glutamine. But you're not really avoiding it because you do make it. And so what Siegfried has started to use is glutamine blockade. So there's different medications, some that have been repurposed, such as fenbendazole, mebendazole, ivermectin, these sorts of things that are actually antiparasitic agents that are being repurposed for use in cancer treatment, because parasites need glutamine as well. And so this is the mechanism of action that these drugs use to kill parasites. And in fact, it's so successful in some areas that people are wondering if cancers are being caused by parasites. I don't think that they are. I mean, we look at cancers under a microscope all the time, and I've never seen a parasite involved. Who knows? But I don't think that's the case. But what is the case is that both cancers and parasites both require glutamine. And so these medications both hit the glutamine, knock out that fuel supply, and both parasites and cancers end up getting really hurt by this, which is great. That's what we want. And so the protocol that Professor Seyfried and his team, which I was happy enough to be included on, formalized that treatment protocol. Just say you should do it like this, and do it in this very set way, very strict. Get your GKI down, get your glucose down as much as possible. You can even use different medications, things like metformin, berberine, that can help bring your glucose down, your GKI down. And then using glutamine inhibitors as well. And there's other sort of adjuvant sort of therapies that can be helpful as well. So it was just trying to formalize and get an actual protocol that doctors, patients, and researchers could look at and say, okay, I'm going to follow this, and we'll see what happens, especially from research purposes. If you're doing something called ketogenic metabolic therapy, you need to be consistent. You need to do the same thing in order to get good results, because people can say, well, we did this carbohydrate restriction and it didn't really help. But then you look at the study and they're using, 200 grams of carbohydrates a day. Okay, well, that defeats the purpose. That's not what we're doing here. We're trying to really eliminate the carbohydrates. So, my role in that was quite minor. So, we get to review the paper, a preliminary version of the paper. We get to make comments and read through it and make any critiques, or say, hey, maybe we can talk about this as well. Put this in the protocol, adjust this, because I have some clinical experience in this. I have used this in multiple patients. It's not the bulk of my practice, but I do have patients that want to address their cancer with ketogenic metabolic therapy as well. And I've lectured on this as well at various medical conferences, using ketogenic metabolic therapy as an adjuvant therapy, as an additional therapy with chemo and radiation. It doesn't have to be either or. In fact, ketogenic diets and ketogenic metabolic therapy can actually support chemo and radiation, because it sensitizes the cancer cells to the chemo and radiation, make them die more from chemo and radiation, and protects your healthy cells from chemo and radiation as well. So it's actually very beneficial to use with chemo and radiation. And then there are things like GBMs, where the chemo and radiation don't do all that much. And so it only gets you a couple extra months. And so people look at that and they say, I don't want to poison my body for a couple months. I don't accept that. I'm going to try something else. Mm-hmm. And so I have a number of those patients that come to me and say, I want to do this, or they want to do it in addition to the radiation and temozolomide. Professor Seyfried is concerned about radiation for GBMs, because radiation will kill cells directly, but at the same time, they'll kill your healthy cells as well, and they'll cause them to release a lot of glutamine. And so it actually makes a very favorable microenvironment for the cancer to come back, because now you're giving it a lot of fuel in the glutamine, and we're not treating the glutamine. We're not blocking glutamine with any sort of medical interventions. So, you use chemo, use radiation, these cancers just come back. They come back. It's considered incurable. So GBM is considered incurable. A lot of brain cancers, you have a difficult time clearing them, because it's in the brain. If you have a melanoma on your skin, you get a very wide margin. You cut out a bunch of skin and maybe even some muscle and bone if this thing is deep in there, but usually not. And you just get a big chunk of tissue, get it out of there, right? And so if you get all of those cancer cells and they're gone, that's thought to be a cure, because you've gotten rid of all those cancer cells. It's harder to do that in the brain. You can't take huge wide margins in most areas of the brain, because it's the brain, and you're gonna really damage somebody and give them severe neurological deficits. But there are certain parts that you can, like in the frontal lobe. We see GBMs in the frontal lobe, and you can actually you can do a frontal lobectomy, and certain parts of the temporal lobe you can take out larger amounts, and so you can get very wide margins on these cancers, and they come back. They just come right back. They come right back at that margin, or previously they did very aggressive surgeries, like especially in kids, you can do this because they'll bounce back, and the other parts of the brain will take up the slack for the parts of the brain that you've removed. But they've done total hemispherectomies, so taking out the entire right hand side of the brain, as well as far as the cortex, the neocortex, and it just shows up on the left side. So it's not something that's thought to be curable. It's when you get that, you have a terminal disease.
Yeah.
And so this is something that gives people just a different set of treatment options. And we have studies, they're preliminary, but we're getting larger and larger ones now that are showing that people are getting much better outcomes adding in ketogenic metabolic therapy. And some of the longest lived people with GBM, we're talking 10 years plus, are ones that have used ketogenic metabolic therapy instead of chemo and radiation.
Yeah.
Maybe they got some debulking, and some of them can't even get the entire thing debulked. It's in an area that they can't operate on. So maybe they remove a little bit of it and leave the rest of it, and then hit it with this ketogenic metabolic therapy. And then, they get better and better results as well. And the tumor starts shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. There's a gentleman, Andrew Scarborough, who's over 10 years with confirmed GBM. And he doesn't, on MRIs, he doesn't have any sign of disease anymore, even though they left half of it in his motor strip because they couldn't operate on it. So it wasn't like they resected all of it and it just never came back. It was there and now it's gone. And we see this in published case series as well from places like Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, one of the top medical centers in the world. It's this a very sort of center of excellence. It's in LA. They published a case series. They've been using ketogenic metabolic therapy for years, and they've used this for multiple cancer patients and GBM patients. And so they have a published case series several years ago where they had a number of these cancer patients that there's third, fourth line treatments, tumor resections and surgeries and chemo, radiation, things like that were unsuccessful, or something was inoperable. And so they went to ketogenic metabolic therapy, and all of a sudden it works. Some of these people had GBMs and they were literally on fourth line treatment. They had a resection, chemo, radiation, re-resection, more chemo, more radiation, comes back again. They have a third resection, then go on something called Avastin, which is basically the end of the road. And you can't operate on that anymore. The tissue's so friable that they'll just bleed out. And so that's the last ditch effort. And so people have gone past the Avastin stage, and this thing's still coming back and trying to kill them. And then they say, you could always try not eating cereal. And they just go, what? Okay. And so they take them off carbohydrates. And in this case series anyway, the tumors shrank. They just shrank back. People started getting neurological recovery, started being able to read again, could go out dancing. They got their movement back. And every single person in that study, in that case series of about 15 people, some were GBM, some were other cancers, every single one was still alive at publishing of that study. And they were all getting improvements in shrinking of their tumors, except for two who didn't stay on the diet. And those two actually had great results, and the tumors were shrinking. They were improving neurologically. And then just for lifestyle reasons, say, I can't really keep this up. I don't want to just keep, eating a whole bunch of meat, and I want some whatever. And they died several months later. The cancer came roaring back. So, it's something that has great potential. And I've seen this clinically. I've seen a lot of people do very well. I've had patients that have had metastatic cancer, breast cancer, other forms of cancer, who have been able to put this into remission. Now other people put metastatic cancer into remission with chemo and radiation, and that's great. But this is something that people are doing with just dietary interventions, non-toxic interventions, which is really, really good. And when you have metastatic cancer, there is absolutely no guarantee that you're ever going to get rid of that. And in fact, most of the time, you're in a lot of trouble. And so having people have more options is only a good thing. And so, I was able to put in my clinical experience and my input and sort of make suggestions. but my role is very small. I mean, Dr. Thomas Daraj and Professor Seafried, did absolutely the vast majority of the work on this.
Yeah. So you've brought up a couple things I really want to dive in. So the mitochondrial aspect, I think that we don't have any sort of a consensus on like what cancer even is, right, and what causes it. You brought in possibly parasites or some sort of connection. Fenbin, for example, has an antifungal component to it, among many other mechanisms that ivermectin, Membin, and Fenbin work. So on that, okay, let's go into the mitochondria a little bit on some things that we do not talk enough, especially in the more of a nutrition focused aspect. And you, with the as a doctor, as a neurosurgeon. With that practice, I think this is really, really important to go into the mitochondria. And so, another aspect of that is you as a podcaster, as well, and the physician, you're able to take some ideas and package them together in a way that you weren't taught in school, and I think that is really cool, and you're always trying to learn. For example, uh, Dr. Sneff was on with you recently, and y'all go into the glyphosate and deuterium aspects. That's not anything that we talk about much. I've
Mhm.
never heard Dr. Seafried discuss that, and I think it's incredibly important, right? And so I think we still have these blind spots in everything that we look at. And so, for example, when we go back to, say, Gilbert Lean, with his assessment that energy has to come from more than just ATP, there's something mathematically that doesn't function. So, can you go into how you now, as a podcaster, as somebody that has crossed a lot of different fields, look at the mitochondria and energy production?
Well, mitochondria are a lot more than just producers of ATP. I think of them sort of like sailors on a ship. I mean, it really feels like they're the real people, and we're just like a spaceship that they're piloting, because they're moving around inside of our cells, turning things on, turning things off, using the different organelles, using the DNA. The DNA isn't a brain. The DNA is the blueprints. And the mitochondria are the architects and the builders, and ones using those blueprints to go and do things with them. But they can actually travel outside the cell. They can travel from one cell to another. They can go through your bloodstream and travel around your body and go to different places. It's pretty amazing. They're actually like running us as a spaceship. You think of us as like an enterprise ship, and they hop into like little elevator thing with our bloodstream and go somewhere else and do what they need to do. It's absolutely amazing, incredible what they do. So it's far more than just making energy. They run our cells, they run our systems and tissues and brain. So they're very important. Importantly, in cancer, one of the things they do is that they are in control of, they have final say on whether or not a cell gets to divide. And so that's what cancer is. It's unregulated cell growth. So there's no regulation. Okay, what regulates it? Well, there's multiple different regulatory steps, but the very last say is the mitochondria. And if the mitochondria look and somehow they can tell if things aren't baking right and they're not splitting properly, they can stop it. They physically stop it. So it's not that it stops until the mitochondria say go. The mitochondria have to stop it. So they have to be healthy and intact in order to meet that role. So if your cell is inappropriately dividing and you have healthy mitochondria, it'll stop that. And this has been shown in cancers. They've taken healthy mitochondria and then put them in cancer cells, and it suppresses the cancer, right? So we know that, okay? So when you get damaged mitochondria, they can't oversee that, and they can't stop this unregulated, they can't regulate cell division, so you get unregulated cell division. Also, if a cell is just too damaged and it needs to die, it's called apoptosis. It's the mitochondria that action that. So the mitochondria see this and go like, this isn't working. We're just going to abandon ship, burn this one down, go to the next one, right? And if they're damaged, even if those signals are coming to them that this needs to shut down, there's no one, at the helm, right? So it's just, you just going to do whatever it wants to do. So the mitochondria are extremely important. When you're in a ketogenic state, this can help keep your mitochondria healthy. I did a video called Cancer's Type 5 Diabetes. And, the reason I did that is because, we call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes is due to insulin resistance of the brain. PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, is now being called type 4 diabetes because you get insulin resistance of the ovaries because insulin blocks the production of estrogen in a specific way because women make testosterone first and that's converted into estrogen in the ovaries. And so insulin blocks that conversion. So now women will get too much testosterone, not enough estrogen, and they'll get polycystic ovarian syndrome. Too much testosterone, not enough estrogen. And a lot of side effects from that. It's the number one leading cause of infertility in women. And it just goes away if you stop eating carbs and your insulin comes down, or you take metformin, which is a diabetes medication. Same thing. So I started calling cancer type 5 diabetes because, again, it comes into insulin resistance. If you are eating carbohydrates and your insulin is elevated all the time, you can't go through autophagy, which is turning over these older, damaged precancerous cells, right? If you're going through autophagy, you're clearing out these older, damaged precancerous cells so they don't turn into cancerous cells, but you're also turning over the mitochondria. So you go through mitophagy, which is a turning over of the old, damaged mitochondria. So they're getting damaged and broken down for various reasons. And now you'll be able to break those down and rebuild new ones and make more of them. That's called mitogenesis. So you get mitophagy and mitogenesis by being in ketosis. Now, some people say you need to fast for 5 days every 3 months to get those benefits. You don't. You just need to fast from carbohydrates. And if you go on a ketogenic diet, like a carnivore diet or any other ketogenic diet, you will always be going through autophagy. And so studies have shown that after 3 months on a ketogenic diet, that you have 4 times the number of mitochondria and they're 4 times as effective. And so unless you're really damaging your mitochondria to a faster degree than you can regenerate and repair them, you're going to be very hard pressed to develop cancer in the first place. And who knows, by going through, some part of the mechanism of ketogenic metabolic therapy may be that you can restore the function of some of these mitochondria in these cancerous cells and actually turn them back and bring them back from the brink. That's a potential mechanism as well. But we know this from something called the nuclear transfer studies. It really shows very point blank that this is a metabolic mitochondrial disease and not a genetic disease. I mean, the consensus is that it's a genetic disease, but the consensus was that the earth was flat for a long time too. So that didn't really age very well. So the proof against the somatic theory is multifold, multifactorial. So, there are cancers in like a tumor where the different genetic changes are different between every cell. Every cell has different genes, and some cells in the same tumor don't even have any genetic changes, but they all behave as cancer as if they had those genetic changes, but they don't have the genetic changes. So why are they behaving like cancer? And then there are some cancers that actually don't have any genetic mutations whatsoever, right? So that kind of throws a wrench in those gears. Every single known cancer has damaged mitochondria. That was shown by Warburg and shown later with electron microscopes looking in and seeing that they're just damaged and gutted and they're dysfunctional and they don't work. And so they all have damaged mitochondria. Now, they took DNA, the nucleus from cancer cells, and with all the genetic changes and hallmarks of cancer, and they took those out and put those into healthy cells with healthy mitochondria. They did not behave as cancer. And you could even clone them into their original animals like frogs and mice and things like that. Then they took the damaged mitochondria out of the cancers and then cancer cells and put those into normal cells with normal DNA. And they did behave as cancer, and you couldn't clone them. They just died. And then, like as I said earlier, they took healthy mitochondria out just to put the nail in the coffin, took healthy mitochondria out of normal cells and put those into cancer cells, suppressed the cancer. Because again, those mitochondria will stop them from dividing, and they will make them kill themselves if they're too damaged to repair. So, when you look at it from that point of view, it's fairly straightforward that this is a much more viable mode of attack. And when you're on a ketogenic diet preemptively, you are going to have very healthy mitochondria. Now, there are things that can damage your mitochondria, the different medications, different drugs, different plant toxins. There are different plant toxins that are considered carcinogenic, and they all damage the mitochondria. There are different genetic issues like Tay-Sachs that damage the mitochondria. And so it all comes back to the mitochondria. So you want your mitochondria as healthy as possible. Now you could do that from periodic fasting, or you could just be in a ketogenic state long term, and that's going to provide you the most benefit of healthy mitochondria. You mentioned energy production and ATP, and that there has to be another energy source in the cells. That's interesting. The thing is that there's something called Brownian motion, and this is just the natural vibration and movement of molecules. And so you have a solution. The reason that you have chemical reactions is because when you pour two chemicals in there, they don't just sit there. They're moving around. They have natural motion, just inherently in those cells. And we call this temperature. We call this heat, right? So at absolute zero, molecules stop moving. That's why something's cold, because it's slowing down that movement. It's taking that energy away from the molecules itself. So all molecules have inherent energy based on what temperature they have. So when you go to absolute 0 degrees Kelvin, that's the point that can't get colder than that, because that's the point where all molecules stop moving. And so there is an inherent energy to all molecules on Earth, living or not. And it's called Brownian motion. And it's actually been shown through various calculations that the energy from Brownian motion is inside the cells, just banging around in your muscles, is enough energy to account for every single movement in our bodies. And all the muscular, running, sprinting, lifting weights. Brownian motion can actually account for all of that energy. Doesn't, it's a bit funny that we have, I can control my hand, I can decide what to do with it, and so Brownian motion is more random, right? So you wouldn't think that this is just all random movements and things like that. But there's a lot of energy there. And so maybe there's something to do with that there actually is some way of harnessing that Brownian motion. And there could be something else entirely that gentleman was speaking about. But that just sort of reminded me of something that I learned back in my molecular biology days.
Yeah, no, I think that's cool. I think that there's still a whole field that we've not crossed over in yet, and that's looking at, for one, the environment piece. I don't feel like we talk about that enough at all. And the big takeaway that I felt like that we have in talking about the problem was that, well, how do we boost the mitochondria? What do we do to make the mitochondria healthy? So one thing that when you couple, like the work of Gerald Pollack together with, say, Roland Van Wyck, and you start looking at Robert O. Becker, Andrew Marino's work, you start seeing that there's a connection in more of the physics side, right? The AMO physics. And so we have mitochondria that I think that there's a whole light piece there that we have missed, right? Because they don't just produce ATP, they produce CO2, they produce water, they produce heat, they produce light. And so we have the photoelectric effect, essentially, that I think is going on in there. That goes down to the melanin piece within the cell. But I want to revert back to the deuterium aspect, because when we look at the mitosis, right? There's a light piece that Becker has clearly shown there. And now, I think somebody we both know was Dr. John Jaquish, that I appreciate. I love him, right? But he's pretty rough. And so I was talking to him about the piezoelectricity of bone, and he's like, if you say that to an orthopedic surgeon, they're going to laugh at you. I was like, but is this not a legitimate thing, right? I feel like we've proven this in the 60s. Yeah, a sidetrack. Deuterium squeezed produces an ultraviolet light, and we know through the onion experiment of Fritz Popp that that produces mitosis, right? That produces cell division. And so when we have an overabundance of deuterium in the cellular matrix that gets squeezed, right? Pressure, you can look at like a deuterium lamp. Like, we haven't put this into biology, but we have it on the industrial application of a deuterium lamp. It produces excessive UV light which leads to cell division, right? Mitosis. So, like, I think that there's so much there, Dr. Chaffee, that we have
Mhm.
not even gone down that rabbit trail to piece it together. And I think that's why when you look at like Glenn Jeffries and Bob Fosbury and Scott Zimmerman, that body of work is so fascinating to me because they're looking at it from a completely different angle. So, do you have any thoughts on more of the that mitochondria piece that maybe we're missing, right? Like I know what we have laid out, but is there anything that we're missing? And then do you have any thoughts on the retina embracing a Warburg metabolism? Because I think that's also something that we never really talk about, and that is, in my understanding, as a country boy in Arkansas, right, that the Warburg metabolism actually decreases proliferation or in that because that pressure within the eye would cause a lot of problems. So I know I threw a lot at you, but I think this is really really cool and one of the reasons why I'm working so incredibly hard to try to get you and Dr. Jack Cruz together because I think that it would just be epic. So
Yeah.
you what are your thoughts?
Oh well, I don't know much about the retina side of things. That's really interesting. But from a mitochondrial point of view, yeah, deuterium is really important. I meant to sort of touch on that in my rant earlier on mitochondria, but deuterium are vitally important for proper deuterium levels are vitally important for mitochondrial function because deuterium is for people that don't know is hydrogen, is heavy hydrogen. So it's a hydrogen proton with a neutron attached to it. So a normal hydrogen is just a proton with an electron, and then you add a neutron on that, it doubles the size and the weight of this thing. So it's a massive difference sterically, but chemically it has the same sort of properties, same sort of nuclear properties, but it is very different in size. And so these molecules get used differently. And so if you have a deuterium instead of a normal hydrogen in a molecule, it will actually change the shape of that molecule slightly. And if you have a lot of deuterium, it will change it even more. And there are hydrogen pumps on mitochondria that they have to bring in mitochondria as part of the electron transport chain. And as in the process of making ATP, they can actually make water, especially when you're in ketosis, you're using ketones. For every 1 kilo of fat that you burn, that you oxidize to make ATP, you will actually generate 1.1 liters of deuterium-free water, completely deuterium-free water. So it's just normal hydrogens. That's because of these hydrogen pumps. They only bring in normal hydrogens. And if a deuterium goes in there, it's too big, it crashes the pump, and it's like throwing a bowling ball in a blender. It's just like it's not going to work. It's just going to destroy the mechanism. And so that's what's happening. If you get an abundance of deuterium, that can damage the mitochondria. The mitochondria try to stay away from deuterium, but it can get overwhelmed. And like you said, if you have an abundance of deuterium, this actually sparks cell division, cell growth. And so this can be certainly thought to be a problem in cancer. And so if you have too high levels of deuterium because you're eating a lot of it, you're bringing in a lot of it, and you're not in ketosis, being in ketosis will naturally lower your deuterium state, hopefully under 120, but at least under 130 parts per million. Above 130 parts per million, you start running into problems. You start having dysfunctional mitochondria, dysfunctional cellular metabolism, and you start getting a lot of metabolic diseases. You're more likely to get cancers, etc. Different plants, most plants will have over 130 ppm, or even on over 140 or over 150 ppm. Processed foods likely have more than that. Even just water, most water is about 150 parts per million. So, we're drinking water and we're taking in deuterium at higher levels than our bodies really want. And, is that normal, or is there something going on in the environment? We've destroyed the microbiome of the planet, and with agriculture, with glyphosates and different things like that, destroys the bacteria and other microorganisms in the ground, and they actually sequester deuterium because they like deuterium. They want deuterium, so they suck up a lot of this stuff. And Some people have theorized that we're actually getting more deuterium in our environment because it's not being sequestered in the microbiota in the soil nearly as much anymore, and now it's now being released and getting out into our food and into our environment and getting into the water, etc. And this is going to cause more problems. So there's a lot of theories out there, but we do know that this damages mitochondria, and that if you get too much deuterium, it will cause cells to divide and trigger that growth phase. And if you couple that, and you're going to get a problem inherently when you have high deuterium, because you're getting this growth signal, this division signal. But if it's high enough already, it's destroying your mitochondria as well. And so now you have damaged mitochondria that can't tell, that it's just getting this growth signal, split, split, split. And the mitochondria is saying, absolutely not, cut that out. But they can only do that so long before they're so damaged that they can't stop the cell from dividing. So it is more than likely, I think it's going to turn out to be a truism that deuterium levels are inherently linked to cancer and cancer development and cancer division. In fact, we mentioned Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who's a researcher at MIT. She did her undergrad and grad school and PhD in computer science at MIT back in the 70s and 80s, and she's worked for MIT as an academic ever since, and taking people through their PhDs in computer science. She did AI for decades. And then when big Google companies and Microsoft, they started going into AI, they had just had so much more money that that she wasn't getting funding for her sort of research. It was like, all right, I'll just move on. And she started looking into glyphosate and other sort of things that interested her, as a very, very bright person and dedicated researcher. And she's come to study deuterium as well. And she's made some very, very interesting discoveries. She's been on several key papers with Professor Laszlo Boros, who's a professor of medicine at UCLA, is now solely studying deuterium and its effects on the body. And she actually thought that cancers might play a protective role on deuterium sequestration, that if your body's getting overloaded with deuterium, this is damaging you and shutting your body down at a cellular level, that cancer may develop in order to suck in more and more deuterium, because their deuterium sinks. They just pull all this deuterium in, and that causes them to grow and divide. But then they grow, and now there's less deuterium, right? So they're growing and growing and growing, and that's sort of diluting out the amount of deuterium in that area. And so, that's a very novel thought, that cancer plays a protective role. But who knows? I mean, we have no idea what's going on here. We know that it has damaged mitochondria, and we know that it requires different energy sources than other cells in different amounts. And we know that there are certain biological properties, but we don't know why all these things come about. And so it's a very interesting idea anyway.
That's super interesting.
And you're talking about light as well. I mean, infrared light has been shown to improve mitochondrial function as well. There's different bands of infrared light. Some only get in a couple millimeters, but some get a couple centimeters. So you can get a bit of penetration. And like I said, mitochondria move around the body. So, if you have like a deep liver mitochondria, it's not that they're just sitting there its whole life and never benefit from that infrared light, because they could be moving around the body and getting those benefits and then moving back to the liver or to the brain. Probably not getting much penetration there, but light is so important. I definitely I really like Jack Kruse. I think he's a very interesting guy, and I think it's great that he's beating that drum. I think it all comes back to what we're biologically adapted for. We're not troglodytes. We're not like chuds that are supposed to like live underground and things like that and never come out and see daylight. We're supposed to be out in the sun. We're supposed to be out in the light, and we're supposed to be eating, certain foods. And so I think this really does come down to living more to our biological design and just getting out in the sun, getting your feet on the ground, getting light in your eyes and on your skin. It plays a massive role. I mean, you're just going out in the sun with your shirt off half an hour 3 days a week has been shown to increase your testosterone and growth hormone in men and improve estrogen in women. Well, why is that? Well, your mitochondria code for testosterone. And so if your mitochondria are damaged, you're not going to be able to make testosterone properly. And if your mitochondria are healthy and you have more of them, you're going to have more testosterone. And this is part of why I see men, when they come onto a carnivore diet, a ketogenic carnivore diet, after 3, 4, 5 months, they can double or even triple their testosterone levels back to very healthy, optimal levels. And even if they're in optimal levels, they can become even better and improved. I have professional athletes that have doubled their testosterone level by going on a carnivore diet and trying to live a more natural life and get out in the sun and things like that. And as a professional athlete, people pay good money to try to double their testosterone and do it illegally and cheat, and could potentially lose their livelihood and lose their ability to compete by taking an exogenous testosterone and performance enhancing drugs and things like that. You just change your diet, go out in the sun, get proper sleep, you can just double your testosterone naturally. And so I think light has a key role in that as well.
I do want to clarify something. I said something wrong. I said Fitzprop on the onion root. It was Derwich. The onion root experiment. Just want to clarify that. I just heard the MedCram guy, Shell Nut. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but that he was just on Cameron Borg's podcast, and it was a really good one because he's coming from he's like a quadruple board certified practitioner, ICU, and he's taking that deep dive into the light. And then there's a couple of new studies that I wasn't even aware of on how much it was positively affecting kids. Like a lot of the studies I was familiar with that he was talking about, but like even 20 minutes a day is having this massive impact. And I think that the linear effect of how deep we're getting the penetration is accurate, but I think that there's a scattering effect. I don't think it's terminal. I think that it's still going through, and that goes back to the Obecker work. We're talking about piezoelectricity and how the fascia are. I mean, they're energy transportation systems. I think that we haven't even hit on that. Another thing, you hit on testosterone. I think that this is where. Are you familiar with Tom Seeger? Seeger, he has a Moroska ice bath. He has done a lot with cold thermogenesis and testosterone, actually. He's been on a couple times. He's Arizona State. And the cold therapy prior to exercising seems to be boosting testosterone like incredibly, versus the opposite effect, the inverse. If you do exercise then cold, it actually tanks. And so there's a lot of interesting things there, but that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with mitochondria, brown fat, the production of endogenous light. I think that's also another piece that the cold comes into. So with that, you have been in this ketogenic carnivore space for a long time. Do you know what the absorption spectrum of a ketone is?
Oh, I haven't looked into that.
It's in the UV range. I think that is absolutely fascinating because I had never thought about it. It clicked for me the other day, just like what is the absorption spectrum of a ketone? Because I personally feel that another way that we've missed the boat on a lot of the more diet-focused first aspects is we don't take into condition location or seasons at all, right? Especially in how we live our lives. And so maybe not everything fits this cookie cutter mold, even on the diet side, right? Like maybe what we do in Ontario is not the same as we should do in Costa Rica, isn't the same as we should do in Perth, right? Like maybe there's some other factors in there that we're not looking at, which is interesting in that that's directly related to deuterium levels, right? Like we're going to have a different natural deuterium level in northern Canada than we are at the equator. And so I think the seasonality is something, and location, something that we need to do a better job on as in this world of having we aren't troglodytes. We're not meant to be in the ground. We migrate, we move based on seasons, based on all kinds of things. And I think that can't be That can't be forgotten. One more thing, and then I want to give you the floor to finish up, is I recently had Dr. Leonard Nyatu on, and he's talking about spin, right? Atomic spin. And he is theorizing that we can endogenously produce deuterium, which is a terrifying thought. But I think that ties completely into this whole aspect of environment that we're living in. So, like, for example, beta oxidation, the TCA cycle spins two ways, and it's dependent on the light input that we have. So, like, not being outside, not having sun, not seeing, having the infrared input is going to affect TCA cycle and therefore beta oxidation. We never talk about that, right? So, just I'm super excited for where we are. I'm super excited for people like you that question and bring together and not like, hey, this is what it is and we're never going to change, because there's too many of those. There really are. So, just if you have any thoughts on finishing up my ramble, it's that's what I love about the podcast. I get to visit with people all over the world that are experts in their field, and then seeing that lattice work of mental models. It is so exciting.
Yeah. Well, I've found that as well, having a podcast. I just get to talk to a whole bunch of really interesting people and expand my knowledge, because you're right. There's way too much inside the box thinking. I never knew what the hell that meant when I was a kid. It's, oh, you got to think outside the box. I want to explain what the hell that meant. Well, what it means is, by thinking that everything that you've learned in school that's it. That's the totality of human knowledge, and it's not going to go anywhere else. And what you learned is gospel, and being very dogmatic in that. And people say that, people in the carnivore space, oh, you're just so dogmatic. No. We're the ones who weren't dogmatic, because we got taught the same load of crap that you did. And we saw something else. We kept an open mind, and we said, hey, look, this actually doesn't fit in the way that I was taught, and that doesn't make sense. And this other thing makes more sense, and let's investigate. And we come to the same conclusion. And there are researchers in multiple different fields that have come to this way of thinking and way of eating through extremely different pathways. I came to it from a plant toxin point of view. We have classified, categorized, and quantified and named about 1 million different defensive chemicals that plants make, even in the plants that we eat. And they're highly toxic. And even the ones that aren't deadly will still cause low-grade harm over time. And there's some plants that we eat that are deadly, but we denature them by cooking or fermenting or doing other sorts of things. And people don't even realize that. And that doesn't necessarily get rid of all the toxins or the cyanide that's in things like cassava. They don't completely get rid of the cyanide. In sweet cassava, they don't even try to, because there's not enough cyanide to kill you. So let's just eat it. No, there's no safe level of cyanide. It damages your mitochondria. It stuffs up electron transport chain. You cannot have functioning mitochondria if cyanide gets too high. And long-term exposure to low-grade levels of cyanide causes multi-organ damage, neurological damage, thyroid damage, mitochondrial damage. And so, this is not something that's safe to have. And so I came in from that point of view and just say, oh, okay, well, plants have toxins. You get everything you need from meat. We've been apex predators for millions of years. That made sense to me. And so I did that. And I started looking into it, started finding all the studies on ketogenic diets, et cetera, which are animal-based diets. It's a high-fat, meat-based ketogenic diet. That's what a carnivore diet is. It's, ketogenic diets are just carnivore with a side salad. And you may not even need the side salad. I mean, people can do whatever kind of ketogenic diet they want. The key is you're eating a lot of fatty meat and you're in ketosis, right? Your insulin's down and your mitochondria can function. And so I came into it from that point of view. My friend, Dr. Sean O'Mara, that guy's so accomplished too. I mean, he was in the military. He was a police officer. Then he was an attorney. Then he decided to go to medical school, became an ER doctor. He was in the military, and he won an award in 2000. He was named the best doctor in all of the armed services, all branches of the armed services.
Wow.
And as a result, they put him in charge of Dick Cheney's, then Vice President Dick Cheney's health, because he was having heart attacks in the White House. So Sean O'Mara was his personal doctor assigned to him by the White House. And so I think he was a doctor to Clinton as well, and then Cheney. And I mean, this guy's had a storied career. And then he got into research. He's been doing research for years and years now too. And he looked at visceral fat, the fat around the organs, and how this is metabolically active and can cause all sorts of damage. And he did a large study with the National Institutes of Science with, I think, around 7,000 patients, did abdominal MRIs, cerebral MRIs, looking at blockages and restrictions. And they found that if you can reduce the visceral fat, you can actually reverse all these metabolic issues and actually they started opening up blocked arteries in the brain. Right. And so this actually shown that this you can reverse these blockages in the brain. And he found that if you reduce visceral fat, all these benefits start happening around the body. And he found that a ketogenic carnivore diet was the best diet to reduce visceral fat. So that's how he came to a carnivore diet. Laszlo Boros, Stephanie Seneff, Dr. Seneff from MIT. Laszlo does a carnivore diet because it's the lowest deuterium diet. It's the diet that keeps your deuterium down the lowest. Meat and animal fat have the lowest amounts of inherent deuterium. Plants have much higher, especially fruit. People talk about having fruit and the plant wants you to eat it. Fruit's growing. And so it needs more deuterium to grow. And so, you have higher levels of deuterium. And so he does a carnivore diet because it's the lowest deuterium diet. I spoke to Dr. Seneff, and she said that she's like, she doesn't do a carnivore diet herself, but she said that she loves the carnivore diet. She loves the idea of a carnivore diet because it lowers deuterium. It's the lowest deuterium diet. So you get all these different people who had open minds, who did think outside of the box and just said, hey, you know what? What we've been told this whole time doesn't seem to fit. And the simple fact that you say people go by the guidelines. Guidelines are expert recommendation. That's the lowest point of evidence on the evidence hierarchy. Right? So guidelines should be a guideline. If you don't know any better, follow that and see how you go, and then learn something about it so you can adjust it on your own. That's what a guideline is. It's a guide if you have no clue. If you do have a clue, then it's probably a bit too basic. And so that's the baseline. So people say, oh, no, but the guidelines say the guidelines say. It's like, well, that's, again, the lowest form of information. And the simple fact that the guidelines are inherently, revamped every 5 to 7 to 10 years tells you that we don't know everything. And the people that put these guidelines in place in the first place knew that we didn't know everything. And so we need to update the guidelines every few years. And so just looking at those dogmatically and saying, no, the guidelines, that's being dogmatic. That's inside the box thinking. And so we're actually the ones that are not dogmatic. We're the rebels, we're the revolutionaries that have said, no, this is the status quo is not the way to go. We need something else. We need something different. And more people are coming to that through different mechanisms and angles. And doctors in particular, when they see this and they see the evidence of ketogenic diets in the literature, and then they have patients that start coming in that follow this, if they keep an open mind, and they will see these massive benefits. And some doctors do that. And that's really, really good. Dr. Eric Westman, I just spoke to from Duke, that's what happened to him. He had this weight loss clinic, and it's just, doing the status quo sort of, way of treating this. And then all of a sudden he had a couple of patients come in just losing massive amounts of weight and improving their health dramatically. And like, what the hell did you do? And it's like, well, I did this ketogenic diet thing. And they went, okay. And he had an open mind. He said, okay, I got to think about this. I got to look into this. And he did. And he found a lot of stuff on it. Now he's been, an expert in the field for 25 years and published a lot of research on it himself. So, it takes that open-mindedness to see something new. If you don't have that, then you're just going to keep doing the same old things and keep getting the same old results. And if you're happy with that, great. That doesn't really satisfy me, because the results that we're getting now it's not good. And in fact, it's going backwards because we're getting sicker. Doing what we're doing now is making us sick. It's not just keeping us where we are. It's not a lack of improvement. We are actively getting worse. We're the obesity rate and metabolic disease rate, chronic disease rate, heart disease rate, cancer rate, autoimmune rate, diabetes rate, type 2 diabetes rate, and even type 1 is going up. That all of these things are going up decade after decade after decade. And the expense to the economy is going up as well. both in real costs, so the direct and indirect costs. Harvard did a study on this. Harvard School of Public Health did a study on this a few years ago, where they just looked at 5 of these chronic diseases, the so-called non-communicable chronic diseases, which I would say are completely preventable and even reversible with certain dietary and lifestyle interventions. I do it every day with my patients, so I know that it's reversible. But just 5 of these things. So it was diabetes, all diabetes, most of it would be type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancers, mental health issues, and COPD. And I've even seen people with COPD improve their pulmonary scores. I don't think it's going to regrow a bunch of scar tissue, but whatever tissue is left, it seems to make that work better. And I've absolutely seen people improve their pulmonary scores and require less oxygen, even with COPD, advanced COPD. So that's interesting. And obviously, if you do this early on, it can prevent COPD, because you're not going to be smoking and doing all that sort of garbage, because they're plants. Right. So you don't do plants. And so just those 5. And that's not including, autoimmunity. And I think that they missed a lot by not including autoimmunity and dementia and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and autism and all these other sorts of things, because the highest grossing drugs on the market right now are autoimmune drugs, not Ozempic and Wegovy, even though they're sold out around the world in many areas. The highest grossing drugs are autoimmune drugs. So I think last year, Ozempic, those drugs made about $4.5 billion in sales. But then Humira, which is an autoimmune drug, I think it was like $5 or $6 billion in sales. Wow. And then there's another drug, I forget the name of it, but it's an autoimmune drug. That was $26 billion that same year, right? So it's autoimmunity that's actually the major cost right now from a drug perspective. But they didn't even include autoimmunity, right? So just those five chronic diseases they include in just direct and indirect costs. They found that in 2010, the direct and indirect costs around the world was around $8 trillion with a T, trillion with a T, right? And by 2030, that's expected to be up around $14 trillion. So it's nearly doubling in the real expenditures for these diseases, right? And it's like, oh, well, we're getting new drugs. Okay, well, we're getting new drugs and we're paying trillions of dollars more for it. Are we getting better results? No, it's actually getting worse results. Okay, so that's stupid. But then there's other ways of looking at cost, because you look at human costs, right? So you look at lack of a lost opportunity costs, of people that are sick. They can't go to work. They can't work as much. They can't work as well. They have sick days. They're off for surgeries. They're taking disability leave, things like that. Those lost opportunity costs between 2010 and 2030 are estimated to be around $46 trillion. Trillion.
That's
right?
But even though, like, our most valuable resource, our most valuable asset's time. Just think about how much time we lose by being sick or being unhealthy, whether it's death or whether it's not able to function. So as we record this, it's the first confirmation hearing of RFK Jr. So do you have any thoughts of that? And are we going to get you back to the United States?
Well, to your point about losing time, that was another thing that they looked at as well, was that lost time in early deaths, premature deaths, and that was actually the biggest cost, was in premature deaths, people dying young and then dying in their 30s and losing out on 30, 40 years of productivity. That in 2010 cost the planet around $23 trillion a year. And then by 2030, they're expecting that to be around $43 trillion per year. So just those 5 diseases, and not all the chronic diseases, you're talking about costing in real costs for, $50-60 trillion a year in direct expenditures, and then loss of human potential. Right. and just on those 5. And so you could probably double that for all the other chronic diseases, right? And so that's gonna break down any system. That's gonna destroy any and all systems around the world, right? And so that's because it's getting worse. Like it's going to outgrow and outpace any sort of innovation that we can do. We need to stop that from happening. We can't just think of some way to just live with this horrible catastrophic progression. You have to stop the catastrophic progression. As far as RFK, I'm very excited about that. He's the first person to put this on a national spotlight and get national attention, that we are getting sicker and we are spending trillions of dollars on this unnecessarily. We're spending tens of trillions of dollars on entirely preventable issues that don't need to exist and didn't exist 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. So I think that's very important to get him involved. He's an environmental lawyer. He's a bulldog. He's going to really go after things, which is going to make confirmation very difficult because he's a threat to a lot of people in the establishment. And I think that people really need to put pressure on their congressmen and senators and things like that, and saying, look, if you go against him, you're going against me, you're going against us, and you're showing us that you're in it for these big corporations that are lobbying and paying you, and the entrenched sort of people that stand to lose by actually getting the truth out there. And we want the truth. We want to be healthy. We want actual real regulatory bodies that are actually there to help us instead of helping themselves. And if we can put enough pressure on our own politicians, hopefully we can get him through. I'm very hopeful. If he gets through, I think that's going to be a very good thing. I think it's going to be a very positive thing. Sometimes you look at these things, you had like the red dye, red 3 or something like that ended up getting banned. Sometimes they throw this sacrificial lamb out there and throw it to the wolves, and it's just like, oh, okay, they're distracted and keep the flock over here. But
Yes.
it happens all the time. They did that with fructose when fructose started becoming more clear that high fructose corn syrup was harmful. You saw some executive from Coca-Cola go on, do like an interview going like, well, why did you use high fructose corn syrup and instead of natural healthy sugars? We just didn't know. Oh God. Oh, we just didn't know how bad it was. Oh God. Oh, if only we knew. It's just nonsense. Fructose and high fructose corn syrup and sucrose is nearly identical. They're nearly identical amounts of fructose and glucose. It's a sham. And so Coca-Cola went back to natural cane sugar. It's exactly the same goddamn stuff, right? And so, that was just a red herring. And I think that things like, red dye 3 is a bit of a red herring. Oh, yeah, we're doing a good job. Okay, well, what about red dye 40? What about the 90 other things that you use in there? Thousands of other things you use in there that are just as bad and have been proven to be bad decades ago, and are illegal in most other countries. But that's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's like we're talking about, in Canada they don't use red dye 40, and in America they do. Canada's just as sick as Americans. Sorry to break it to you, and the problem with health in America is not solely related to red dye 40, the red dye 40 and the Fruit Loops. It's the Fruit Loops. Like, Fruit Loops are freaking horrible. Actually, it was funny. I actually saw a brief clip with Jack Cruz and Callie Means, where he was going off about the simian virus 40 and all these different sorts of vaccines and all these people die. And he's like, and you're talking to me about Fruit Loops? So we're talking about all these millions of people dying. You're talking to me about Fruit Loops? Yeah. Fruit Loops do kill people too, but it's Fruit Loops are the embodiment of processed foods.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about red dye 40 in Fruit Loops when it's the Fruit Loops that are the problem and all the junk food that's the problem? But all these things are a problem, and I agree that, the points, it can be more than one thing. There are a lot of bad things, and we need to keep that in perspective and not just get myopic on our one area. We need to address all of these things. It's not good enough to just get one area. But, as far as RFK, we need to make sure that we don't just get a couple red herrings and scapegoats, but then they keep the body of, processed food and hot garbage and vilifying meat and saturated fat and cholesterol and things like that to push their plant-based narrative and their processed food agenda, because processed food is plant food, and they make a lot of money off of this. It's a huge markup, and it makes us sick and require tens of trillions of dollars in medication, which they also conveniently provide for us. So that's the main problem. That's the main goal for me. And hopefully, I think RFK is the right guy to do it. He certainly doesn't seem like he's going to be distracted by a red herring. I think he's going to go for the throat on a lot of these things. And so hopefully he gets through, and hopefully he does just that.
I agree. I'm with you, brother. I'm rooting for him all the way. Are we going to get you back to the United States to practice? We can't. We don't have enough. We don't have enough good people.
I hope so. I'm actually in the States at the moment, but I'm still practicing back in Australia. So I'm still seeing my patients on video link. But we'll see. There's a lot of things going on, like, with my fiance and things like that. Like she, it isn't the right time for her to move countries at the moment as well. But that's the plan down the road, is to come back to America when we can make it work.
Love it, man. Thank you so much for all that you do and taking the time to visit with me again. And just keep it up, my friend.
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure to be back, and good to see you.